the ministry of the Word until March the 3rd. Before our departure, we visited Botany, 5 miles from Sydney, and on the 3rd went by railway in full view of the Blue Mountains to Bathurst, where I held 5 meetings. After leaving Bathurst, we returned to Sydney. On March the 11th, we started by railway in the afternoon and traveling all night, arrived the next day at Melbourne, where in the course of our stay, I held 26 meetings at various churches, chapels, halls, etc. in the city. These meetings included 3 services in the Theatre Royal, where each time I addressed 3,000 persons, and a meeting at the Great Town Hall where I preached to a congregation of 5,000. After leaving Melbourne on April the 28th, we visited 5 towns in the colony of Victoria, at each of which places I held several meetings and then returned to Melbourne, where I conducted 3 more services. From Melbourne, we sailed to Sydney, where I labored for the Lord during the second visit until July the 14th. On that day, we left Sydney and landing at Brisbane in Queensland on the 16th. We remained there until August the 10th. At Brisbane, I held 17 meetings altogether at the various places of worship in the city. On August the 10th, we sailed from Brisbane, and after calling at Rockhamilton and 5 other towns on the east coast of Australia, landed at Java and went by railway to Batavia, the capital of that island. There, in consequence of the mixed character of the population, which consisted chiefly of Dutch, Malays, Hindu, and Chinese, and because a good interpreter could not be found, I was unable to hold any meetings. On the morning of September the 1st, rising soon after 3 o'clock, we sailed for Singapore, where we arrived on September 3rd. The next day we continued our voyage, stopping at Saigon on Cochin, China, on our way, and on September the 12th landed at Hong Kong, where we remained until the 30th of that month. When my service for the Lord at Hong Kong had come to an end, we went by steamer to Shanghai, where I preached many times, and afterwards sailed on board a Chinese river steamer for 650 miles up the Gang-TSI to Hankow, where after calling at WU-HU and KIU-KIANG, 2 towns in the banks of the river, we landed at 7 o'clock on the morning of the 29th at Hankow, at Nanking, the ancient capital of China, and at Qinqiang. I held 15 meetings altogether, some of which were in English and others in English with interpretation into the Chinese language. On November the 8th, we returned by steamer to Shanghai, where I conducted 2 more services. On the 13th, we sailed for Japan, landing at Nagasaki on the 15th. In the course of our stay in Japan after leaving Nagasaki, we visited Yokohama, Tokyo, the capital of the empire, Kobe, Osaka, and Kyoto, at each of which places I held numbers of meetings, most of them being in English, with translation into the Japanese language by Monsignor Ishitomo Sanjiuro and Kijinosuke, then Ibuka, who acted as my interpreters. At Tokyo, a large hall called the Kosiekwam and the Shinseika Church and other places of worship were generally crowded when I preached, with most attentive hearers. On January 7, 1887, we returned to Kobe and, embarking on the 10th, sailed via Nagasaki for Hong Kong, where we landed on the 16th. But during this, our second visit to Hong Kong, having a cold and desiring to obtain rest, I did not hold any meetings. On February the 1st, we sailed from Hong Kong and landed at Singapore Straits of Malacca on the 6th, where in the course of our stay, I had the privilege of holding 11 meetings. On February the 21st, we left Singapore, and after calling on PENANG on the 23rd, disembarked at Colombo in Ceylon on the 28th, whence we proceeded by railway to Kandy, 73 miles from Colombo, but in consequence of our short stay there, I had no opportunity of holding meetings. On March the 1st, we rose at 4 o'clock, returned to Colombo, and embarking, sailed for Marseilles, where we landed on March 26th after an exceeding rough voyage along the Mediterranean. On April the 4th, we proceeded to Nice, and remaining there until June the 4th. I preached many times in English at the Scotch Church and conducted 2 services in German, also in the same building. On the 4th of June, we left Nice and reached the orphan houses on June 13th after a tour of 37,280 miles. 15th tour, Australia, Tasmania, New Zealand, Ceylon, and India. August the 10th, 1887 to March the 11th, 1890. On August the 12th, 1887, we sailed for Australia and arrived at Albany, King George's Sound, on the west coast of Australia on September the 18th. At Albany, we remained until the middle of the day and then sailed for Glenelg, where we arrived on September the 21st. On the 22nd, we went on shore in a steam launch after the voyage of 11,183 miles from London, in the course of which I had opportunities of preaching Lord's Day after Lord's Day in the saloon to the passengers and officers on board, and had the services well attended. After landing at Glenelg on September 22nd, we went on immediately by railway to Adelaide. On Sunday, September the 25th, I commenced my labors at Adelaide by preaching at Zion Chapel in the morning and at the Presbyterian Church in the evening to large congregations. Besides conducting services at Adelaide, I preached also in 15 other towns, preaching generally 6 and sometimes 7 times each week to crowded audiences. On December 1st, we left Adelaide by railway, went to Mount Gambier, 305 miles from Adelaide, and resting at 4 o'clock on the morning of December the 7th, we went by an early train to Narracoort and visited Bordertown afterwards, at each of which 3 towns I preached repeatedly. I preached altogether in South Australia about 70 times. On the evening of December the 9th, we left Bordertown and, traveling all night by an express train, arrived at Melbourne on the morning of the 10th. On the 13th, we sailed from Melbourne and landed at Hobart in Tasmania on the evening of the 15th. 1888, at Hobart, Newtown, Perth, and Launceston, I preached 25 times, generally to large congregations. On the afternoon of January 12, 1888, we sailed for New Zealand and arrived at Invercargill Bluff on the 15th. In Invercargill and neighboring places, I held a great number of meetings, and at Dunedin, I preached twice at the Garrison Hall to about 2,800 persons each time. On the afternoon of February the 23rd, we sailed for Wellington. There I preached on 2 Sunday evenings at the Opera House to immense audiences, besides conducting a large number of other services in that city. After preaching in several places in that district, we went by sea to Auckland. We were there more than 10 weeks, and at Sydney in New South Wales above 18 weeks. Then we went to Ceylon, staying more than 3 weeks, and in Calcutta above 15 weeks. Then we went to Darjeeling on the Himalaya Mountains, as I labored on at Calcutta until the thermometer was about 110 degrees in the shade, and the heat was so excessive that we could not endure it any longer. On the journey to Darjeeling, Mr. Muller was overcome by the heat that Mrs. Muller quite thought he would have died in the train. During some of our tours, we have for many weeks together been exposed to cold from 50 to 56 degrees below freezing point, and at other times to heat from 90 to 110 degrees and upwards. Discomforts which must have been experienced in order to know the full force of them. Then on the sea, again and again, very heavy gales and even a typhoon, having overtaken us when the trials thus occasioned were severe. On the land, we had to travel on a stretch not merely for 20 or 30 hours uninterruptedly, but more than once we had been on the railway 6 days and 6 nights in succession. Though on the whole we have had excellent accommodations during our long journeys, yet sometimes we have been obliged to put up with the most trying and inferior kind. Twice, though in the best cabins on board large first-class steamships, we have been exceedingly tried by insects. In the United States, in New South Wales, in Ceylon, and in India, the mosquitoes were most grievous, and in 2 first-class steamships, rats so abound that they ran over us by night. Yet hitherto God has helped us, and we doubt not will help us to the end. 1889. After the monsoons had set in, and thus the excessive heat been a little decreased, so that the traveling would not be so dangerous, humanly speaking, we left Darjeeling to go to Simla, a beautiful town in the Himalaya Mountains, in order that I might preach at Simla, and also to the thousands of inhabitants and visitors there assembled. This long railway journey from Darjeeling to Simla via Calcutta of about 1,600 miles was connected with many trials, but the Lord carried us through them. We stayed 10 weeks and 4 days at Simla, and then left for Mussoorie, another town on the Himalaya Mountains, where we stayed from September 21st until October 14th, while at Darjeeling, at Simla, and then at Mussoorie. I had not only an abundance of opportunities of preaching to Europeans, to Eurasians, and to Americans, but also to educate natives in English, and to the uneducated natives, too, with translation into the Hindustani language. I sought likewise to make good use of the opportunities thus afforded to me of meeting the very great number of missionary brethren and sisters coming from the plains to the mountains, and to strengthen their hands in God. After we had left Mussoorie, we stayed from October 14th to the 18th at Dehra and then Doon, where I preached a few times only, and then started for Delhi. At Delhi, I had again opportunity of preaching to Europeans, to Eurasians, and to natives. I addressed soldiers also and large schools of Hindus and Mohammedans. On November 1st, we left for Agra. There, as in many other places, I had special meetings for missionaries and Christian workers, generally, in order to lend a helping hand to them in their service and to seek to benefit them through my long experience of many years in the service of the Lord. I had meetings again and again also with soldiers, either to win them for the Lord or to help on spiritually those who were believers, and I held meetings likewise to address the native churches. At Sikandra Orphanage near Agra, I addressed 300 native boys, girls, young men, and young women, with translation into their own language. I also addressed about 300 educated natives and some European ladies and gentlemen in English. On November 21st, we left for Kanpuri. Besides preaching there 7 times to Europeans, Eurasians, and Americans, I had also a special meeting for educated natives and another for about 50 missionaries. On December the 11th, we left Kanpuri for Allahabad, where, besides preaching in various churches 10 times, I addressed also about 300 young men. In Allahabad College for nearly an hour and spoke to 700 native Christians belonging to 5 different churches who had assembled for a love feast in the open air. 1890, death of Mrs. Wright. On January 2nd, we left Allahabad for Jubbulpore. During our stay in this city, I preached 14 times at various churches with great help from the Lord. While thus quietly and happily going on in my service at Jubbulpore, a letter was handed to me from a missionary at Agra, to whom Mr. Wright had sent a telegram that he must inform me of the death of my beloved daughter, his wife. Our plans were now completely altered, and it was obvious after prayer that we ought as soon as possible to return to England and see what could be done to fill up the place of my dear daughter, who for nearly 30 years had gratuitously labored at the orphan houses, but who had died in Bristol on January 10, 1890, in the 58th year of her age. We decided, therefore, that at the first suitable steamer from Bombay would we return to England. I pause here for a moment. Mrs. Wright was my only child, who for nearly 44 years had sought to walk in the ways of God. Without any previous information of her illness, this announcement came suddenly to me. To many persons this would have been a heavy blow, and so it was to me, for I greatly loved my daughter. But my heart remained in perfect peace, because I took this affliction, as I had taken former heavy trials, out of the hand of my Heavenly Father, fully realizing that He had taken her to Himself and had done therefore to her the very best thing that could happen, and that to me this event would work for my good. Because then, as I believed Romans 8:28 to contain the truth of God, and as assured that it would be even so in my own experience, my heart remained in peace, perfect peace. May all my beloved fellow believers seek to lay hold on the truth contained in Romans 8:28, if they have not as yet done so, in that, under heavy trials, their hearts may be in peace. As it had been with me, so I found it to be with Mr. Wright, much as he had been attached to his late wife. On January 24th, we left Jubbulport for Bombay. There I preached 15 times, and once in German, to the sailors of a Prussian man-of-war, who, by the courtesy of the commander, were allowed to come to a very large tent, in which all the meetings at which I preached in Bombay were held. On January 21st, we sailed from Bombay to Brindisi and arrived on March the 11th in London. During this passage, I preached on board the ship. Whilst in London, I preached also in the large mid-May conference hall. In this our stay in London ended our long journey. When we returned to Bristol, I had great cause for praise that the whole work was going on so well under the direction of Mr. Wright. 16th tour, Germany, Switzerland, August 8, 1890 to July 5, 1891. For more than 9 months I labored again at the orphan houses, but as I greatly rejoiced and required rest, Mrs. Muller and I left home again on August 8th for the continent of Europe. After visiting Brussels, we went to Cologne on the Rhine, enjoyed a little trip up the river on board steamships to Neuwied, Coblentz, and Mayence, surrounded by the picturesque ruins and beautiful scenery for which the banks of the Rhine are celebrated, and on August 16th arrived at Heidelberg, where I preached 4 times at the German Evangelical Chapel in that city. Soon after our arrival in Germany, however, when we heard about the sad state of things in the professed evangelical churches of that country and in Switzerland, we felt constrained to lengthen out our stay on the continent, especially as I had received great numbers of invitations from brethren residing in Germany and Swiss cities to preach in them for some time. And no sooner had I begun to accept these invitations that I found that the Lord was pleased so graciously to bless my labors that I was convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that we ought to prolong our absence from England in order that I might not only become the instrument in His hands of the conversions of sinners, but also that I might in particular lead on believers into a further knowledge of the truth and strengthen the hands of those persons too who remain sound in the faith. From Heidelberg, we went on August 20th to Stuttgart, where I held a great number of meetings, and on Sunday, August 31st, conducted 2 services at Kornthal, 5 miles distance from Stuttgart. The love of the truth was so great that I had always extreme difficulty to reach the desk at the large hall of the Burger Museum from whence I spoke. And the last few times that I preached was obliged to be admitted through a side door into this hall, because by the ordinary way the desk could not be got at on account of the immense crowds which filled the building. But the great spiritual blessing which was given surpassed the delight I felt at seeing so great a multitude. And after having remained for 27 days at Stuttgart, and on September 13th my dear wife and I left for Staffenhausen, there I preached at the great Johannes Kirche to more than 2,000 people on each occasion, and twice at the large chapel connected with it, to about 800 persons the first time, and to 900 afterwards. And here at Staffenhausen too, God gave much blessing. From Staffenhausen we went on to Zurich, where I could conduct 6 services and address more than 1,000 persons at each meeting with great help from the Lord. 4 times I spoke also to about 700 or 800 persons under each occasions. After leaving Zurich, we traveled on to Winterthur, but there I preached only once on October 3rd. From Winterthur, it's Winterthur, we proceeded to Basel, in which city I preached 3 times to many hundreds of hearers. 12 meetings I held at the Great Hall on the spelled Verins and then Haas, which each time was filled with about 2,000 people, and once I addressed 90 students of the Basel Missionary Society, to the students of which society I had years ago given addresses repeatedly since March in the year 1835. While at Basel this time, I addressed 70 students also of a Pilgrim Missionary Society at St. Chrisschona, 7 miles from Basel. But my last meeting at Basel was for Christian workers, when many hundreds of them were present, to whom I spoke for more than an hour. Our stay at Basel was a precious season and real blessing. Through the Lord's great kindness was left behind. And leaving Basel, we visited AARAU and BIEL, at both of which towns I held meetings. The next city to which we went were BERNE, where I began my labors on October 26th, but I never addressed such crowded congregations, about 2,000 people at each meeting, as I had all the 16 times that I conducted services at the Great Hall of the VERINSHAUS during this last visit to that city. The 2 closing meetings were particularly for Christian workers, when the blessing which the Lord was pleased to grant was great indeed. On November 5th, we left Berney for THUN, where I preached 4 times at the parish church and once at the Wesleyan Chapel. And there also the Lord brought out large congregations and gave much blessing. Everywhere on our present visit to the continent of Europe, I had the joy of seeing how, notwithstanding the increasing infidelity and the open rejection of the truth on the part of many persons, and even of professed ministers too, there is found on the one hand hunger after spiritual food, and large numbers come out consequently to hear the gospel whenever the truth is faithfully proclaimed by real servants of the Lord Jesus Christ. From THUN, we went on November 21st to LANG, where I preached to crowded, most attentive audiences with much help and manifest blessing from the Lord. During the whole of our stay at LANGNAU, the cold was intense, and all through the winter afterwards. Occasionally, the thermometer sank to 20 degrees below freezing point, but the Lord sustained us through the trial, though in consequences of having spent so much time for years past in tropical climates, we felt the severity of the weather to be exceedingly great. On December 1st, we left for St. Kellen, where I preached 9 times and addressed the boys and girls of the reformatory institution once. In this city also, I not only had large congregations at each service, but preached the word with remarkable help and much blessing from the Lord. From St. Gallium, we went to Haydn, where I preached 4 times, and here at Haydn, as well as at THUN and at many of the other cities and towns of Switzerland and Germany. I had most profitable intercourse with the pastors of the churches, for in many places these beloved brethren considered that God had especially sent me to promote their comfort and benefit by giving them counsel and advice. From Haydn, we went on December 20th to HERISAU, and there I preached on December 21st and December 22nd. On December 23rd, we left for HAUPTWEIL, where I preached 4 times at a large hall, and where also I had pleasant, profitable conversations with fellow laborers in the Word. And after our departure from there, on the morning of December 26th, we traveled to Chur, a town situated in a very picturesque and mountainous district on the east of Switzerland. In the course of our railway journey to that place, whilst the weather was bitterly cold, we observed the high mountains in every direction covered with snow, noticed large masses of thick ice floating on the rivers and lakes, and found the frost most severe during the whole of our visit to that beautiful locality. At Chur, I preached twice at St. Martin's Church, 4 times at St. Regella Church, and attended 2 prayer meetings during the 2nd week of January, where I gave short addresses to the persons who had assembled at the hall. 1891. On January 7th, we traveled to Constance. In this town, where more than 4 centuries ago John Huss and Jerome of Prague were burned as martyrs at the stake, I preached at a large hall 8 times altogether. On an island of the Lake of Constance stands the Instel, that's INSEL, hotel, at which we were staying, which is a very large old building and was formerly a Dominican monastery, inhabited only by monks and friars. This old building still contains an ancient tower in which Huss was imprisoned for some time before he was put to death. We next proceeded to Carlsruhe. In that city I preached 23 times at 2 large halls in the course of the 27 days we were there, not only with most decided help from the Lord while speaking to the unconverted, but with great blessing to young and uninstructed believers also. Many other persons, too, were confirmed in the faith, whilst numbers were brought back, as I learned afterwards, to the truth from which they had departed, and thus were led to trust with greater simplicity in the Lord. On February 14th, we left for PFORZHEIM, and in this large town stayed 8 days, and I preached 7 times to such crowded congregations at the hall of the Orangehaus, and I had the greatest difficulty to press to the people in order to reach the desk from which I spoke, and on the last 3 occasions had to obtain an entrance into the hall through a side door which was open to me for the purpose. My heart was then greatly refreshed at seeing almost everywhere in Germany and in Switzerland such a desire to hear the truth, notwithstanding the departure of so many persons from it. On February 22nd, we went to Friedberg in Baden, where I held 15 most happy meetings at a large hall. And in this city, as in all the other places we visited, was so greatly helped by the Lord that it was most manifest I had not labored in vain. Here also, as in all the other places in Germany and in Switzerland to which we went, we were most affectionately entreated to come again soon. After our departure from Friedenberg, we went on to West Baden, where during the 11 days we stayed, I preached 8 times at the hall of the VEREINSHAUS, and at the Kaiserhalle to large congregations, and I learned afterwards with much blessing, for believers were edified and careless unsaved persons were converted through my ministry. We went on March 28th to Frankfurt on the Main, where in 23 days I preached to many hundreds of hearers at the hall of the Vereinshaus and at the Christus Kirch, 18 times altogether with special help from God, both as regards the conversion of the unsaved and with reference to leading on believers in the knowledge of the Lord with blessing. I heard of by letter from brethren residing at Frankfurt soon after we had left that city. On April 22nd, we left Frankfurt for Bonn on the Rhine, at which city I preached at the Gemeinde Haus and at the Johanneum 15 times altogether. We then proceeded to Cologne, from which place an omnibus conveyed us to Deutz, a small town near Cologne, in order that I might hold a few meetings at Mulheim on the Rhine, which is only 3 miles from Deutz. At Mulheim, I preached 5 times at the hall of the Young Men's Christian Association, and on May 16th, we went on to Essen, where I held 6 meetings altogether. On the morning of May 17th, Whit Sunday, I preached at the Market Kirch at 9:30 to a large congregation consisting of more than 2,000 people, and on the evening of that day, at 8:15, conducted a meeting at the Gemeinde House, where about 1,500 persons were present. On May 20th and 21st, I gave addresses at some conference meetings, which were held at a large hall in Essen. On Sunday morning, May 24th, I preached at the Great Paulus Kirch to an immense audience of more than 2,500 people, and on the evening of that day, at 8:15, held a meeting at the Gemeinde House, where about 1,500 persons had assembled, which was my farewell service for Essen. On the afternoon of May 25th, we went to Barmen, where I preached at the Vereins House, at the Christus Kirch, at the Evangelical Vereinshaus, at the Great Haupt Kirch 4 times only, to very large congregations, as these buildings were crowded to the utmost at each meeting. And at the Haupt Kirch I had 2,500 hearers altogether. On the evenings of June 2nd, 3rd, and 5th, I preached at Elberfeld, 3 miles only from Barmen, to very large congregations, and my service at Elberfeld on June 5th was the last I had the privilege of holding in that town. All my numerous meetings in the course of this long 16th missionary tour have invariably been conducted in the German language, with the exception of one large drawing-room meeting held at West-Baden on the afternoon of March 18th, when at the mansion of the Princess Elizabeth von Schleppenberg-Lippe, a quarter of a mile from the hotel at which we were staying, I addressed more than 100 ladies and gentlemen in English by particular request. 17th tour, Germany, Austria, and Italy, June 1891 to May 1892. After having preached many times at Barmen and Elberfeld to very large congregations, we went to Cassio, where I preached twice in 2 different churches and 3 times in halls. I held also a meeting with pastors in the city and neighborhood, whom I addressed for about an hour and a half on points connected with their service for the Lord. I spoke likewise to 400 prisoners who were confined to a gaol at Cassio, and was glad to find in this city much more spiritual life than when I last preached there, more than 10 years before. On July 13th, I left for Berlin, to which city we had been most affectionately and pressingly invited to come. I held there 7 meetings and preached once at Charlottenburg, about 4 miles distant. We should have stayed longer in Berlin, but I had a most pressing invitation to go to Hamburg, which, for particular reasons, was at once to be complied with, and on this account we left Berlin on July 28th, with the understanding that we would come back about some time. After having preached repeatedly at Hamburg, which services were a particular joy to me, because I had never before held meetings in this large city, we went to Halberstadt, where I had lived for more than 5 years, while attending the Cathedral Classical School there, in order to prepare for the University of Halle, and I had therefore particular delight in preaching in one of the Protestant churches in this city to a large and most attentive audience. At Halberstadt, we went to Wernigerode, a town at the foot of the highest mountain in Germany, the Brocken, where I preached to a large congregation at the largest church in the town. From there we went to Helmsley-Slafen, a town where I had lived with my parents from the time when I was 4 years and a half old until I was 10 years and a half of age, into which town I went from the school at Halberstadt again and again at the time of vacation, and also visited Helmsleben, at a later period for the sake of seeing my father. It was a particular joy to me to find here a large hall, which I could rent for the occasion, a building which was not to be had when we were on the continent the last time. I considered it, therefore, an especial honor and privilege to be allowed by the Lord to witness now for him in the very place where, as a boy and young man, before my conversion, I had only dishonored him. From the city we went on to Magdelenburg, one of the largest fortresses in Prussia, in order that there also I might witness for our precious Savior, and the Lord gave unto me the desire of my heart. For I preached 5 times in this city to numbers of attentive hearers. I had long wished to visit Magdelenburg, because it was a place where in the days of my youthful folly I had often sinned against God, so that I was particularly glad to labor for the Lord in a city where I had formerly dishonored him. After I had finished my service at Magdelenburg, we went to Brandenburg, where I preached 3 times. From Brandenburg we went on to Stettin, the capital of Pomerania, where 14 years before I had held several meetings, and this time I conducted services on 5 occasions altogether in various churches of that city. After leaving Stettin, Mrs. Muller and I went a second time according to agreement to Berlin, where I preached 10 times more in a large hall to congregations of many hundred persons. On October 14th we left Berlin for Liegniz, where I preached 5 times, and then went to Breslau, the chief city of Silesia, where I preached 3 times to the Moravian chapel and held a meeting for the students of the University of Breslau, whom I addressed in the Johanneum. From Breslau, we traveled on to Vienna, the capital of the Empire of Austria, where the population is almost exclusively Roman Catholic. And there I preached 8 times at the Reformed Church and in the Methodist and Baptist chapels. I am ready to preach everywhere, provided the foundational truths of our holy faith are held and nothing is expected from me which I cannot do with a good conscience. On November 25th at 8 p.m., we left Vienna for Florence in the north of Italy, where after traveling all night and one day, we arrived a little before midnight on the 26th. In the course of this, our 4th visit, I preached 4 times in the Scotch Presbyterian Church, held 2 drawing-room meetings at the house of the Presbyterian minister, and 4 large drawing-room meetings in the apartments of the Canon Seymour, an English clergyman residing in Florence. 1892. From that city, on December 31st, we traveled all night to Rome, and thence on January 1st, 1892, proceeded to Naples, where we arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon on New Year's Day. Our stay in that large city lasted until May 2nd, and during the 4 months we were there, I had preached many times in the Scotch Presbyterian Church in English, also at the Hall in English, with translation into Italian by Count Papenegouth Oswald, a Christian gentleman who resides in Naples. The longer we were in that city, the more my work became enlarged. But as it appeared for various reasons desirable that we should for a time return to Ashley Down, Bristol, we left for England and landed at Dover at 9:30 on the 9th of May 5th. We had been absent from home for 1 year and 9 months. In the course of the last 17 years, having traveled about 200,000 miles altogether by land and by sea, in the Lord's service, my dear wife and I had abundant reason to praise God for having sustained us in health and vigor of mind and body up to the present time. End of chapter 17, having been read by Peter John Paresis, also known as Brian Dean. None of my audios are copyrighted. Please feel free to make as many copies as you desire to the glory of God.